Hello. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 11. So I hope you're doing well. And Chapter 11 is about alternative paths. So we're going to take quite a kind of a detour from some of the other world religions and maybe ones that you definitely have heard of before. And really going to look at just several different religions here. So very interesting chapter as well. I think that's true of all of them. So the author leads us to his travels, and he's in Beijing, China, and then also off to Vietnam after that. And he has visited the Confucian Temple of Literature, and there it has a statue of Confucius, and again he just sees lots of different things that probably he had read about and finally got a chance to see. And then in Vietnam, he's going to encounter the religion of Cao Dai. So that sounds like one of the new ones there. But that's a very prominent religion in Vietnam, and again, more experiences for him to see. So he encounters a yellow cathedral, and then he starts seeing people that are there dressed in robes of many colors, and they start to chant, and then he sees a large eye, and he wonders about its significance and why they call this service a mass. So that's a little preview of what's to come. And as we look at our first slide, the origins of a new religious movement, religions are constantly changing. And so lots of reasons why. But, followers of one religion move to another culture, and then their religion mixes with another one, and then that somehow kind of really, in effect, creates a new religion. So that's one of the ways we have these new religious movements, or NRM, that our book talks about. And maybe a second reason that they come about is because of social problems that people face and they encounter, and then that leads to the emergence of another new religion, or at least a blending, some type of outcome like that. Maybe a third scenario, and this one I think is pretty prominent, or that's the one I think is pretty prominent, is you have people who disagree over religion, and then they can't come to a resolution. They separate, split, and then create a new branch or a new faith. Maybe another one is sometimes people have new insights, and then from this, for example, they start a new religion. They attract other followers who are also interested in, maybe you can have a new faith that way. So from our textbook, for example, one way that we can experience that is from Shinto. You had Tenriko and Omoto, and then from Christianity, you had some of the denominations like Mormonism and Christian Science, and from Buddhism, the same thing was experienced there. That our book, would fall upon. Another one that we'll encounter a little bit later is Baha'i. And that is a movement that grew out of Shiite Islam, and we'll see that a little bit later in our recording today. Okay, so these blends, or syncretic, is another word to indicate blend. But the Cao Dai that mentioned earlier, blends Christianity with Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. Santeria, another one that we'll see that's primarily in the Caribbean. It mixes Christianity with West African religions. And then we'll see some other blending movements, or syncretic movements, that have grown out of Shinto, Buddhism, and Hinduism. Now the chapter really kind of looks at contemporary paganism and the Yoruba tradition, religions that come really from Africa. And then we'll move to some religions that have elements of Indian spirituality. That's Theosophy and Scientology. And then we'll look at the Cao Dai, that's close to, some of the Chinese, different forms of Chinese religion that we've covered in the book. And then finally wind up with some that have Christianity and Islam in it, such as Rastafarianism and then Baha'i. So, and then from there, I think I'll make some comments relative to some of the parody religions. So, you have some faiths out there that are kind of poking fun at others, but yet they're still taken in a serious manner. Now our next slide mentions two words that we see, but sects and cults. And the sects are sometimes applied to these new religious movements that we're going to be talking about, but sect is on the slide too. That's Latin for cut, but it usually has no negative meaning. Now, cult is also a Latin word, and it means cultivate. So that might bring to mind, somebody who is an overly powerful leader that's very charismatic and followers that just kind of fall in line, and maybe you find them separating from society as a whole. Now, Christianity was once viewed as a dangerous import into Roman society, so it was actually called a sect. So it wouldn't be surprising to see this label applied to any of the other so-called, world religions that we've looked at in our book. Now, if you see the abbreviation of NRM, that's that new religious movement that we'll be talking about in our chapter today. Okay, so when we move on just a little bit, now I'm going to lead up to this slide, but there's a few other things I wanted to mention. But when we talked about contemporary paganism, so I want to mention really Wicca and Druidism as two examples of that type of thing. Now, contemporary paganism is a general name for religious movements that attempt to return to earlier nature-based religions. So a lot of these can be traced their way back to early cultures that were alive and thriving in Europe. So a lot of times pagan sounds like a negative word, and it can be used in a demeaning way to mean like uncivilized, but in reality the word is used to refer to more early nature-based religions. It's not supposed to be negative. Pagan is a Latin term for countryside, so that fits in well. And nature religions were practiced not in the city but in rural areas rather than being in close into town. Now, paganism claims that as Christianity spread throughout Western Europe, these practices that had been there did not really die out. So maybe some of them, they went underground for cover to hide themselves. Maybe they took an outward public Christian appearance to survive and not be suffer death or be persecuted. But then in private, they continued this practice they had already been doing. So a lot of these go back to Celtic mythology as their foundation. And one of the best known of these is Wicca. So Wicca comes from an Old English word that suggests an association with magic, separation, and holiness. And some people use a different name to refer to Wicca, and they call it the craft or the old religion. So Wiccans, they worship both goddesses and gods, and their sacred imagery of these gods and goddesses is rooted in nature. So again, it's multiple deities and that have male and female aspects. So a god would refer to the male aspect, and a goddess would refer to the female aspect. Now, Wicca teaches that the divine manifests itself in opposites. So that might remind you of the yin and the yang, such as light and dark, or male and female that we had talked about earlier in the book. But the Wicca does emphasize the female aspect of the cosmos, and women play a prominent role of bearers of knowledge and leaders in the rituals that Wiccans would perform. So the Wiccan calendar, for example, is based on the sun and moon. They're held as sacred symbols. There are turning points called sabbats that indicate their solstices and their equinoxes. So the full moons are called esbats, and they are marked by ritual gatherings. So there are stages that Wiccans recognize from, for example, that indicate the higher knowledge, and by the time you get to the third stage, then one is established and can start their own coven or worship group. Now the Wiccan reed comes from that English word for advice or counsel, and some say that's just a gentle form of the golden rule. And it basically states that if it doesn't harm anyone, then you can do what you want, or in common words, you're free to do what you want as long as it does not harm others. So Wiccans are generally vegetarians, and and they're very concerned with not harming the earth. They want to protect the natural environment. They go by the law of the triple return, which says whatever you do, good or bad, it will return to you threefold. And this energy that you send out returns to you again times 3. So there are some books out there. For example, Margaret Murray has written one and basically showing that witchcraft had existed in Europe up to the modern time. So, it has a long history, I think, is what she's saying. But there are other names in our book that show how Wicca has made its way to America there and helped to establish maybe some of these rituals and phrases and other elements that are part of modern day Wicca. The Druid movement began in the 18th century, and it was an attempt to reintroduce the religion that had been practiced in France and England by the Celts. Again, that goes back a long time, maybe a couple thousand years. And so there is some writings that provide early information on these Druidic practices. And Julius Caesar recorded some, and the Roman historian Tacitus was another source of this, but maybe there's some bias that has been recorded with them. So the Druids themselves were an elite group of professionals who acted as judges, teachers, counselors, doctors, and priests. And sometimes the preparation process to become a Druid lasted up for as long as 20 years before you were fully initiated. So they too were polytheistic, that they have many major deities. They're usually related to nature. There's lesser deities too. And some have about 30 major deities, and some of their writings have up to 300. So, for example, the sun and fire were important symbols of the divine. Now, when they would worship, the Druids, for example, would go out to an open space where there was a grove of trees, and in particular oak trees. And so the word Druid is actually thought to mean oak tree wisdom. All right, so those are maybe some of the things about Druids, and there's different paths of practice and stages of knowledge. So there are bards, there are Druids, for example, that distinguish just a little bit. And the Druids follow the same calendar as the Wiccans, and so they also have a little bit of similarity in that regard. The Stonehenge, I wanted to say monument, but those stones there in England are a little bit predate the Druids, but a lot of times people, when they think of Stonehenge, they also think of the Druids, that circular stone complex that very famous that we think of today. All right, so moving on to our slide, and there with the Yoruba-based religions and Catholicism, so that shows our blending that we've been talking about, again, for many of our videos. But the Yoruba tradition of Africa is an example of how people move from one culture to another, and they bring their religion with them, as kind of we started out with our slides. So Yoruba really came about because enslaved Africans from West Africa were carried to South America and other locations, including the Caribbean and North America. And so what happened, the Yoruba is emerged that blended elements from the African indigenous religions and then with Christianity. So that explains our slide and what's on there. But today the Yoruba live in basically what is called Nigeria. And they, for example, again have a lot of similarities to the Christianity through Catholicism, and their devotion to deities and saints. So there's a lot of emphasis on the spirits and pleasing them. There's the importance of the rituals, and then, of course, with sacrifice, and we'll get into that just a little bit later, but in the description. Now, one of the best known mixtures of Yoruba and Christianity is called Santeria. We also have something we'll talk about today, voodoo, I'm sure you've heard, and candomblé is another that are prominent out there. These are also some of those alternative paths that our book mentioned. Now, these three are sometimes referred collectively as the religions of the Yoruba tradition. So they're not as old as some of the major religions we've covered, but at least several hundred years old. But again, a lot of blending going on. So Santeria was influenced by Spanish colonials in Catholicism, and Voodoo was influenced by French Catholicism and developed in Haiti. And Candomblé was influenced by Portuguese Catholicism and developed in Brazil. Santeria means saint thing or saint way. Originally, that was kind of a negative way to identify the movement. Yoruba actually means my friend. Now, that is more a term that's gaining more acceptance because it's more positive. Voodoo comes from a word meaning mysterious power, and sometimes voodoo has negative connotations too. All right, so now in these religions, there's a lot of masks that are worn. There's a lot of dance and the rituals. They venerate the saints, and that's those who have deceased and passed on. That they want to honor and remember them. But these religions seem to believe in a high God and supernatural beings who kind of mediate between God and the people who are alive. And of course, spirits are very big. Have a firm belief in spirits and how they can contact them, and the spirits have effect in the physical world. So all of them have a different word in which they call spirits. For the Yoruba, they call it the Orisha. That's the spirit that they can contact, and sometimes these spirits can take over human bodies. In Santeria, they are Okas. And then the Iwa in Candomblé is, they are the Orixas in Candomblé, and in Voodoo, they're the Iwa instead. All right, but the Yoruba, they think of these spirits, the Orisha, sometimes refer to them as God, and when they're doing some of their religious rituals, these Orisha can take over a believer's body who goes into a trance, and then they think this person becomes the God, and there's hundreds of them here for the Yoruba of Africa. All right, so they have different names. They also have priest, high priest, and typically, only men can do that, but times again are changing, and where women are becoming more involved. So a lot of the worship that the Yoruba engaged in includes prayer, drumming, dance, the offering of goods, and then with the Orishas and some of the things that happen there, that's a possibility. And then sacrifice of animals such as chickens, doves, or goats. Sometimes they use instead food offerings instead of a sacrifice. Now, these religions, they're meant to be serious attempts, and that's going to be different from the parody religions we encounter much later in the video today. But these are recognized really as official religions, and they have headquarters in some cases. All right, so New Orleans, for example, has a history with voodoo, so that shows you again how far they've come and the importance of that they've taken on. We want to move on to another path that you can take, religious path, and again, some of these may be more familiar than others, but theosophy is our next one. That word, for example, means divine wisdom. It comes from the Greek. But in general, it refers to mystical movements of all types. So, when you say mystical, that means that direct experience with God. So it's going to borrow quite a bit from Hinduism and Buddhism. In a lot of its teachings and doctrines, it may not call it that, but it really is borrowing. So theosophy itself is eclectic, so it's going to take a little bit here, a little bit there, and things that it likes and put it all together. So whether it's from Hinduism or something of Judaism or else, you're going to have that combination. Now, the founder of theosophy was a Russian woman, and her name was Madame Helena Blavatsky, is I think how it's pronounced. But she eventually started the Theosophical Society in 1875, and then later on she started her World Center of Theosophy in India. But, for example, what happened there is this religion has, again, borrowed heavily from Indian thought, and it's going to have a lot of teachings like karma, reincarnation, yoga, and meditation. And she claims that she was taught some of these things from ascended masters or her traveling and reading. But she spent some time in the United States and then left and moved to India. She had some other people who were very close followers, such as Colonel Henry Steele Olcott. And then after her death, she had Annie Besant and Charles Ledbetter, who basically took over when the founder died. Now, these people who took over, they found somebody that they thought fit all the characteristics of the person, following Theosophy would have. And this person was called the Krishnamurti. And at any rate, this individual did agree to basically kind of hook up with Theosophy and teach its teachings and try to spread it to others who were interested in it. They were interested in the spiritual levels of the human body, such as the astral. They were interested in the spiritual aspects of physical realities or auras. They were interested in levitation, clairvoyance, and they found this, world teacher. That was what was prophesied, and hey, they found this person in Madra. And then eventually this person, again left Theosophy and started his own little thing there in the United States, in Los Angeles, and where he wrote and taught for many years and attracted a following there. Now, Theosophy is no different like our other religions, but it has undergone divisions, and there are several different branches out there, and one of those is Anthroposophy. And it was founded by Rudolf Steiner, but again, he was a Theosophist but left, and he wanted to start an educational program that would develop the whole person. He was interested in this after doing quite a bit of reading from various authors, and then his ideas started in the Waldorf School for the training of young people. So it taught traditional academic matters, and then a lot of the things that he believed were important that helped to promote the complete development of the individual. So Mr. Steiner wrote many books, again, with his personal beliefs when it comes to religion in it. The last offshoot of Theosophy on our slide here is abbreviated CUT, or the Church Universal and Triumphant. And it was begun by Elizabeth Clare Prophet, and that's fairly close to our time. But at any rate, it blends Catholicism and Asian beliefs. But the Church Universal and Triumphant believes that spirits of great people can help humans from a realm beyond the earth in their development. So they believe in the Christian Bible and the Rosary, and they believe that some of the saints that they would say are important for their faith are Buddha, Jesus, and Mary. And there's in our Blackboard shell, there are some videos in the extra resources folder, and there are some in there including the Church Universal and Triumphant. Now, it doesn't sound like Theosophy has had a big impact in terms of numbers of adherents, of people who believe it, but it does seem to have had a fairly larger impact than maybe just the numbers would suggest. All right, but a lot of these different branches have investigated all kinds of things, and one of them that's interesting is automatic writing. So that's when somebody is involved in a trance state, and then they just start producing these religious writings and beliefs. So they're really looking into the paranormal and hypnotism and trances and things along those lines. All right, our next one involves Scientology. I'm going to look a little bit at that. I've got a couple of slides there. But what it shares with Theosophy is that it does have roots in Indian spirituality. So the founder is L. Ron Hubbard, and again, kind of close to our time. And he was initially an author who wrote science fiction books, but again, he did a lot of traveling too. But he started Scientology in 1954. So it's really about fulfilling your human potential, and again, in the early 1950s. So it eventually becomes the Church of Scientology. And this, the overall goal is to help people clarify their understanding of the human process of knowing and knowledge. And so he came up with a whole lot of terms, and we see some of these on the slide that help you know, for example, how far along this process you actually have come. So Scientology comes from scientia, which means knowledge, and then logos, which means really reason or understanding. But it's a knowledge of reason or understanding to help one see reality more clearly. And then if you do that, you can respond to the world more reasonably. All right, but now the two beliefs that seem to be particularly important for Scientology are Hinduism and Gnosticism. So now the church believes that in every person, their core is called a thetan. And overall, the church believes there's a spiritual purpose to life. So the thetan is in a state of imprisonment. It's this part of your spiritual being that longs to be free of the physical body. So the material world is known as the MEST, matter, energy, space, and time. So the thetan, again, longs for independence. It's the core of the person, their immortal spiritual being, and it just wants to be free. Now, Scientology is going to believe in rebirth, but it's really not going to say that so much in words, and it becomes more and more important as Scientology grows and develops. Now, a lot of people who had undergone training in Scientology spoke of their need to overcome difficulties that had harmed them in their previous lives, and so that may remind you about karma and reincarnation. So the goal is to remove these barriers, to find out what they are, and to remove them, and so that a person can go on. Now again, Scientologists are not going to use Hindu or Buddhist teaching words like moksha, nirvana, or enlightenment, but those ideas are really suggested. Now, your journey towards increased understanding and liberation is shown on a chart called the Bridge to Total Freedom, or for short, the Bridge. So Hubbard wrote another book called Dianetics, and that is to help lead the book upward. And just a few more terms maybe on our chart, but a pre-clear is a person who is at the beginning of this process on the Bridge to Total Freedom. So they have not removed any of these blockages that are preventing one from their spiritual development that they need. The operating thetan is the person who has reached a state of liberation. The state of general liberation, freedom, is called a clear. So now individuals can take this journey on their own, or they can use a guide to help them called an auditor, and to go on this journey and to find new ways of mental focusing and to find any blocks that may be out there to an individual's growth. Now the blockages are called engrams, and the auditor, the helper, may use an e-meter to determine these blockages that can be resolved. So the auditor would charge a fee for these services, or in some cases the organization, the church itself, would accept payment in the form of service from somebody instead of a money payment. Now, Scientology will allow you to practice other religions while you're practicing Scientology, but usually it takes up so much of your time, there's not any time really left over. Now, generally with Scientologies, their buildings they meet in look more like office buildings than churches. And then when you go to a service on Sunday, that's when they meet. They will read something from L. Ron Hubbard's writings, maybe a videotape of his speeches. There will be a minister who gives a sermon on some point of Scientology, and then there's a time for sharing of viewpoints. Announcements are made, and then a closing prayer that would probably have been written by Hubbard, or one of his writings in the past that was used. So Hubbard's birthday is March 13th, and so the church sometimes celebrates that as a festival in honor of their founder. So that gives maybe a little bit of idea about that. So the other slides go to that process by which you're trying to clear up these problems that somebody may have had these experiences in these past lives. So there's again, lots of material out there if you're not familiar with Scientology and some of these modern searches of religions, that if I've got some in the additional resources, but there's others out there too that give you a good idea of what's going on with some people's actual life experiences. All right, so before we get to Rastafarianism, that's a little bit down the line, I want to mention some of these others, and Cal Dai is one of the religions we started off in the introductory story there in Vietnam. And it is, at least by our author, called one of the world's most unusual religions. But again, it blends a lot of the religions from China along with Christian monotheism. So it's got a whole lot of saints that it would actually venerate and say that were important. It has a beginning there from an individual who lived again in the late 1800s and was really there on an island, and then he had some revelations and was somebody who was practicing really another religion at the time, but animism was important in talking to the spirits, but now he's getting all these revelations from the spirits. And then this is where the large eye comes from, is he repeatedly saw in the air an image of a large eye. And so this eye represents divine providence, and it's frequently enclosed with a triangle, and that's known as the symbol of the Trinity. So now this symbol that we're talking about, if you've got a dollar bill, take one out and turn to the back, but you will see that divine eye representing divine providence is on the back of the $1 bill of the United States. All right, and it's also on the Great Seal of the United States. Okay, so this one individual, I think his name is pronounced Ngo Van Chu. I'm sorry about that pronunciation, but the new religion Cal Dai was eventually announced about 1928, and unfortunately the founder died just about 4 years later. Now, the primary teaching of Cal Dai is that all religions are based on revelations from God, but some are wrong, and there's been misunderstandings, but Cal Dai says it's got its right, and that these revelations have occurred in different phases. Now, there's 3 different phases out there that they say, or the Cal Dai religion would say, that's happened. Now, Cal Dai, just a few other things there is, again, some of the clothing and the colors have all kinds of meanings and things like that from some of the different faiths that it pulls from. Cal Dai has a structure that's hierarchical in nature, but it's might remind you of Catholicism because it's led by a pope and followed by angels at its headquarters. So there's about maybe 5 million followers of Cal Dai. So again, it's that's not a large number, but still quite a few. All right, so in Rastafarianism, now it's also another religion, but it rose in Jamaica in the 1930s, and it's been strongly influenced by Christianity. Jamaicans, for example, were desirous of independence, their freedom, and so there was an expression there of antagonism to colonial powers, and you can understand why. But some of the important individuals in Rastafarianism are Marcus Garvey, but he helped to organize an association that really basically was a forum to help black people really develop their abilities, much like kind of we've seen with Malcolm X before in a previous video. But Garvey wanted Africans around the world to unite and to not experience any more oppression. And basically, he thought to do this, you would need to teach African culture in the schools. Now, another individual that we want to look at is Rastafari, and he takes the different name that we also see on the chart. But Ras means head, and Tafari means awe-inspiring. So now he was eventually crowned Bishop of Ethiopia, and that's when he became ruler, that he changed his name to what we see on the chart, Haile Selassie, and that is power of the Trinity. That's what that means. So he is really held up greatly by those who are in Rastafarianism. So many people believe that he is a descendant of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba that are mentioned in the Bible. Now, a lot of people said that this Rastafari was going to be really kind of the new appearance of Jesus, and a lot of people wanted to go back to Africa there, and there was some talk about land was being purchased and going to be given to people who wanted to do that. All right, but there again, just you cannot overestimate how important Rastafari was to the Jamaican people. Now, they also believe in one God, and his name is Jah, J-A-H, but that's related to Yahweh and Jehovah. Again, they're influenced by Christianity. Rastafari is held to be divine, from some of the earlier things that have mentioned. That seems, in line with some of their reasoning. He is called the King of Kings and Lion of Judah. Again, Christianity-type references. They would claim that the Bible has hidden meanings for people of African descent, and the book of Psalms, Daniel, and Revelation have some of those passages that they would say that hold those special meanings for African people. But they would definitely believe that Jamaicans and Rastafarians and people of African descent should not be oppressed by any other group of people. All right, but their position at first maybe was sharply critical of white society. That's kind of softened over the years. Now, they would also believe that marijuana is the holy herb. Now, they're going to back that up, again, with Scripture. They're in Genesis and Revelation. They would say, hey, these are passages that say this is the medicinal herb for healing. That's an interesting viewpoint. Rastafarians allow their hair to grow in long coils that are called dreadlocks, and this, for example, is something they believe is important. Now, the dread in dreadlocks has been used as an adjective to mean strict and righteous. So, there are some rules about hair and beard hair and all that in Judaism in Leviticus chapter 19 and also in Numbers chapter 6, where, hey, males were prevented from cutting their beards and side whiskers. So not uncommon to see that. Rastafarians, they avoid pork and shellfish. They usually don't want their food natural, no preservatives, additives, pesticides, or herbicides, and many are vegetarian for health reasons. Bob Marley and his son Ziggy are famous musicians and also well-known Rastafarians who help spread their beliefs through their reggae music. Rastafarians use 4 colors, and there's some interesting reasons for that, but they use black, and that represents people of African origin. Green represents the hills of Jamaica and hope for the future. The red represents the blood shed by martyrs for the cause of liberation from the oppression that Jamaicans saw. And then gold represents Ethiopia, the focus of African pride. So you see this in shirts and hats and all kinds of things like that, but that's the significance of those colors. So in religious services, music is very big. Music, songs, and drumming seems to be very prominent too. And you see that Rastafarianism has spread again to the U.S., Australia, Canada, England, and the Caribbean. All right, moving on just a little bit further to Baha'i. This is a religious movement descended from Islam, and particularly the Shiite of Persia or Iran is where it comes from. So remember, the Shiites are going to be the successors of Ali, the son-in-law of Muhammad. And a little bit of background shows that somebody who was very important for the founding of Baha'i was Sayyid al-Muhammad, who didn't live very long, but he had pronounced that he was the long-awaited last imam who had returned to earth, and then he took a religious name, a different name called Bab, and B-A-B, and that meant gate or door. So a lot of people heard this, and this caused conflicts with those who were traditional Muslims, and they put Bab in prison and then executed him in 1850 when he was still either 30 years old or 31 at the most. Now, one of the followers in the Babist movement for Bab was a young Persian aristocrat, Mirza Husain Ali, and he later became known as the Baha'u'llah. And again, my pronunciation may be a little off. I apologize for that, but that literally means the glory of Allah. And again, people thought that was blasphemous. He was nearly killed. He was put in jail in Iran in the Black Pit. That was a notorious underground reservoir that was used as a prison. So while he was in prison, he experienced months of divine revelations. They eventually let him out, but then he was banished, and he began a life of exile and wandering around all over Iraq, Turkey, Egypt, and Palestine. And then finally he declared that he was that messianic figure that had been prophesied about, and he finally lived out his last years in the western part of Israel. But he had written many letters to world leaders and talked about some of the ideas that he thought would be good. And one of those was a one-world government. And he did that because he didn't want to have war. And he thought if you had one government, then that would make it to where you couldn't have war. Now, people in Iran who follow Baha'i, they are really persecuted quite a bit. Now, Baha'i sees that all religions are partially true, that all religious founders have seen some sort of religious revelation from God that has some merit to it. Now, it also wants to see the day when divisions between religions will disappear. And in a Baha'i service, they're going to read scriptures from many of the world's different religions and trying to overcome some of these differences, and so that they won't, become extreme and maybe prevent even war in some cases. But the faith itself believes that every person has an immortal soul, and that after death, the soul goes on to different realms of existence beyond the earth. There's a belief in reward and punishment in the afterlife. Heaven and hell are not used so much as places, but as metaphors that talk about how close or distant one is from God. So Baha'i is concerned with emphasizing improving life in the world now. It looks to seek for equality between men and women, education for all, an end to poverty, end to war, end to prejudice, and intermarriage to occur as well. All right, so the calendar, they have their own calendar that has 19 months with 19 days, and then 4 extra days are added to the final month. They have lots of observances like fasting that reminiscent of Ramadan in Islam. So in the period of March 2nd to 20th, they would do the fasting, and then their new year begins on March 21st. Followers of Baha'i do not drink alcohol, they don't smoke, and they usually don't practice polygamy. They do allow divorce. The followers, when they meet in their homes or a temple-like building. Most of the buildings may have 9 sides, and that's because they believe the number 9 symbolizes completeness and perfection. And all total, there's probably about 6 million of followers of Baha'i worldwide. So this next slide here talks about what we've been mentioning is some of the beliefs. One God, regular revelation, the soul and afterlife, the unity of all religions, equality, gender equality, world government, and education. Now there are, or at least one article, a small article about some other movements that have happened. They really didn't rise to the level of a religion, but show, for example, Jose Rizal and his efforts of trying to improve the country, but again, his life was cut short because he was executed after being imprisoned. Had wrote a couple books, but he just wasn't appreciated at that time. Now, before we get to the last slide, there are the parody religions. So our author, before he gets into that, mentions, a lot of the religions just don't seem to have a lot of humor in them. Although, he tries to mention a few scenarios where he thought was humorous, but I just didn't find them that funny, and you may find them funny, and I just missed it. But, for example, when Abraham haggles with God in Genesis 18, that was seen kind of as a little funny thing, or how Noah's wife kind of nags him a little bit, and her personality may have been humorous to readers, or how in Hinduism, Krishna was a humorous character. He loved butter and stole it to enjoy. So in Buddhism, Buddha is often, or a holy person is often seen as fat and laughing. So maybe there are some examples out there that can be considered humorous. But now these definitely parody religions kind of definitely fit on that quite a bit. So the ones that our book mentions is Pastafarianism, and that is really a protest to intelligent design theory. But this religion teaches that the universe comes from a supernatural being called the Flying Spaghetti Monster. And again, in our extra resources, I think I have a clip there. But the members wear pasta strainers on their heads, and they'll take official government photos with these strainers on their heads. The church has a prayer book. Now, this is funny to me, but it says, "Give us this day our garlic bread." Now, that goes well with spaghetti. But, should this be considered a religion? And some people will defend their right to do that. There is Dudism. Dudism claims it is basically on par with Taoism, but it wants to lead a peaceful, untroubled, and content life. And they actually use the Tao Te Ching, the same sacred book that Taoism uses. But they are going to argue that their church emphasizes the proper psychological state for ideal human beings. Tarvuism is a spoof religion off of British comedians. And there was a television show called Look Around You that parodied instructional religious videos. So, for example, they parodied Scientology and Christians, but that's what Tarvuism is. Eventualism is a parody religion that mocks belief and challenges the spiritual convictions of others through humor, satire, or other type thing. All right, and one other that I wanted to mention was the Church of the Subgenius, but it again kind of pokes fun at better known belief systems, and one person that they claim to be a prophet is J.R. Bob Dobbs, who was a salesman supposedly from the 1950s. I'm not aware of him, but is held up as a prophet by this Church of the Subgenius. So those do seem, again, more humorous attempts, and but some people would say and take them in a serious way. One other thing there that I wanted to definitely mention was humanism, and that's maybe, it seems kind of ironic, but it's a religious movement of a secular nature. So we've talked about, religious societies and where you don't emphasize religion and just the study of science. Well, that's really what humanism does, because it's going to focus exclusively on earthly concerns of human beings and not even consider the supernatural. So it's also called ethical humanism and has been developing for about the last 200 years. There are various versions of the Humanist Manifesto, but its principles can be found in this document and what they believe and what they find to be fulfilling for human life on the here and now. All right, and as we look at this last slide, the important elements of new religious movements, it does mention a lot of these are small and they're very intimate, and that may be very attractive to people who are into this. There's again a brief section in our book that kind of talks about this. Finding where you fit in is a very interesting thing. Now, if you have the streaming service Hulu, now I like documentaries, but just to show you how these small groups and the closeness is so important, there's a documentary called Hail Satan, and it does involve Satanism, but it was really, I think, kind of enlightening. But it talked about how a lot of those people, they just didn't believe in traditional stuff, and what really attracted them was the closeness of the group. So whether it's that or these new religious movements, I think that is a really attractive point to find people to come together. Now, another point on our slide is that women are playing a big role in a lot of these new religious movements. So whether it's Wicca, Theosophy, or the Yoruba-based religions or Christian Science, these movements are either started or led by women. Now, another important fact is the mystical element and an active devotional life. That's critical too. We've again seen that in so many of these. And then there seems to be some type of program that stresses self-development, which is important to people for physical and mental health. So, for example, Cal Dai, it stresses that self-cultivation and the virtues that are described as well. Others have systems of self-development, maybe like Scientology that was mentioned earlier. So this kind of winds down our chapter, and I hope this has been helpful. Please take advantage of the other resources in the chapter if you need them, such as the practicing with the vocabulary or the notes and outline to help with the reading. And then if there's something I can help with, please contact me. So have a good day, and I will see you the next time.